Part 1 of 1 Corinthians, a story that we also call church fights. Now, we're going to divide up 1st and 2nd Corinthians and give each of them 2 parts. So there's 1 Corinthians part 1 and part 2. 2 Corinthians part 1 and part 2. So the next 4 insights, this one and 3 more, will be on the 4 parts of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. First of all, we'll tell you a little bit about the city itself. Corinth was a city of about 200,000 people. It sat at a very key place as far as trade is concerned. Ships, rather than going all the way around Greece and chancing storms and pirates and all kinds of things, they would come into one side of Corinth at a seaport and then transfer the cargo overland to the other side and then sail on from there. So consequently, you had people going both directions. This was a large city for trade, but it was also a large city for entertainment and just meeting all these people and with all the various, it was a corrupt city. It was an immoral city. On top of that, they had a huge temple to the goddess of love. And the people themselves, there was a wide mixture of Romans and Greeks and Jews and people from other nationalities, just a big mixture. So consequently, the church was full of these people who had come to Christ, but were still wrestling with many of these problems. Immorality was there, and you had the bosses of people who were trying to take control and fighting one another, and the dividing themselves into groups. It was a difficult church. The city was so bad that there was a term which was Corinthianize, which meant to be immoral and corrupt. Now, with all of this, the church was full of divisions. Some say, I'm of Paul, and some say I'm of Apollos, and some say I'm of Peter. Well, I'm of Christ himself. These particular characters, we of course have Paul, but here we get a little bit better picture. Paul was he was not much to look at. He was probably stooped over and had a long crooked nose, the best we can figure it, and bald head, which was to his advantage, of course. But he could have had certain sicknesses. His eyesight, he was probably partially blind. And on top of that, maybe had fits of depression, had fever and headaches. One of the reasons that many times a doctor traveled with him and met certain needs. He was probably not a great speaker. Where Apollos, who came later, was more than likely upright and tall and was a good speaker and eloquent in his reasoning powers. The opposite of Paul. So you could see why people would go to one side or the other about these two men. But how Peter got in there, I don't know. I don't think Peter ever visited Corinth. The only thing I can figure, and this is just my own theory, is that on the day of Pentecost, when all of those nations were there, and many of them come to Christ, there were people from Corinth who came to Christ and stayed a while until the persecution came. So they were under the teaching of Peter and the apostles. So they could step up and say, well, Paul, he's kind of a Johnny-come-lately, and Apollos is even later. We go back to the day of Pentecost itself and under the teaching of Peter. Just people to give even a better say, well, I'm of Christ himself. It was a time of great turmoil, and Paul had to deal with this thing. The thing I like about this section of 1 Corinthians is Paul's description. Give us a little bit of peek into the life of the apostles of that day. Being 2,000 years later, we put the apostles up on a pedestal. We have them walking around with their clean robes and a little bit of a halo on their head, and people ooh and ah. Well, that wasn't the way that it was at all. They were, according to what Paul describes, they were down pressed, and they were constantly being attacked and going through all kinds of tribulations and trials. I think his description of the abuse that they went through gives us a little bit of a picture. And they were not only martyrs at the end of their life, they were martyrs all through their life. Well, come back when we give you more insights on the second half of 1 Corinthians.